Today, my guests are two experienced drug diversion and compliance managers. We have Dr. Adam Beeler. He works for the University of Kansas Health System, Rock Chalk Jayhawks, and Mary Nelson, who works for Honor Health in Arizona. The three of us had a really good conversation the other day surrounding drug diversion investigations, and in particular, the interview process. And boy, do I wish I had the camera rolling that day, because it was a fabulous, spontaneous conversation. So we are going to do our best to kind of recreate that on that topic, because I think it will be a topic of interest for all of you listening out there. So let's set a little bit of context first. I'm going to start with Adam. Adam, can you start by giving us a high-level overview of your investigative process? And then when it comes to interviewing, who typically conducts those at your facility?
Sure. So our investigations typically start by using an AI-based platform. So a particular person flags within the system. My team does an initial review of the individual. And at that point, we make a determination whether we think that there's diversion or not. And so within that conversation, there's a lot that goes into that. It's very collaborative. But from there, we collaborate with our nurse managers, or if the employee is of anesthesia or pharmacy, we collaborate with that employee's supervisor. And so at that stage, we introduce, why we're talking to them, what our concerns are, really trying to highlight the information for them so they don't have to go recreate what we found. And then from there, we make very guided suggestions as to what to do for next steps. And so within our institution, our next steps typically leads to a fact-finding meeting with the employee who is suspected of diversion. And within that process, it's typically the supervisor of the employee and either an experienced nursing director, experienced pharmacy director, or someone from HR as a witness. Within the state of Kansas, we're not unionized, so we don't have to worry about a union rep being present, but typically we'll have that conversation of what the concerns are, prep the individuals for that conversation, and then allow them to guide the conversation with their employee and that other person as a witness and a note taker. And then from there, we typically would put the individual on admin leave and issue a urine drug screen at that time pending the results. And so I think that's really important for us as well, because within that time, we also do more investigation, more follow-up if that person reveals more information that we perhaps did not catch initially. And so that allows us time to do that. And, obviously we do our reporting and everything we're supposed to do on that end as well. But that's kind of our initial investigation response. And those are the folks who are running the fact-finding meeting.
Okay. And when you say additional time, when you do the urine drug screen because you're waiting for the results to come back, then you're
correct.
Doing whatever else you need. Okay. All right, Mary, same question for you. Walk us through your process.
So actually very similar to Adam's. I also have a surveillance, drug diversion surveillance analytics system that cases can be escalated to me through that. But there's also cases, and I'm about 50-50 in the data that I keep on cases coming to me through surveillance versus cases coming to me through someone saying, hey, I have a concern. Can you look into this? Whether that be, a nursing leader or a report from a patient. We've had a few investigations start from a patient reporting concerns or other staff members. So again, about 50-50 on how those cases first come to me for investigation. So then it's, the typical investigation, just really digging through chart audits, looking at, delayed in administrations, anything that's not reconciled, whether that be a full dose versus undocumented waste. So just kind of going through all of those things that we usually identify as patterns in the data. So looking very deeply at that. Early collaboration with a department director, whether that be a nurse or an anesthesiologist. They understand their department workflow and culture, but they also know any other behavior. So that's one thing I'm always interested to know before I escalate to a diversion response team are there behaviors that you're concerned about that I wouldn't know about just by looking at the data? You know, absenteeism, showing up late, unable to find someone during a shift. You don't know where they are. They don't really have a good excuse to where they are. Are other staff members complaining about this? Because oftentimes it might not be the nurse leader that knows about this, but co-workers or colleagues know, like, dang, every time I look for so-and-so, I can't find them during a shift. So again, those are things that you really have to coax out, those behaviors, because they're obviously not clear in data. So once you kind of have enough pieces of a puzzle to escalate a concern of diversion, we do have campus-based diversion response teams. So those are leaders, executive leaders, nursing leaders of the particular person we're looking into. Pharmacy, security, I think is important to have security on that team as your liaison to law enforcement if necessary. And also, they just have great investigation skills, outside of controlled substances and medications and clinical type of investigation. So very important to have them. And obviously HR, in my organization, if drug diversion wasn't pharmacy's job in the past, it was HR's job in the past. So it's important to kind of bring everyone together from their perspectives and really make drug diversion everyone's responsibility, right? So the decision on next steps is made with that team at each campus. And typically when we get to that level, like, we need to have a discussion. Most often it moves to investigation, interviewing, urine drug screening, that paid administrative leave as we do more investigation. So that's typically the path that we go. Every once in a while, we'll say, let's monitor and kind of keep an eye, see what else is going on. But most of the time, we move and escalate to a full investigation from there.
Okay. All right. So a lot of similarities. And I think, Adam, when we had spoken last time, you have a diversion response team of some sort that is, you had mentioned collaboration in the decision. Is that what you were referring to? You have a set team that kind of reviews?
Yeah, so we have, it's really two different teams. One, the diversion response team is really dedicated for, thinking of like a PSRT, or patient safety response team, right? So if there's an employee who's found down with perhaps a needle, they're unconscious, we're suspecting diversion within that, that's when our diversion response team is activated. We're really trying to clear the scene and make sure everyone's safe. But in terms of our day-to-day investigations, my team leads the investigations, and then from there we just collaborate with the nurse manager or supervisor at that point. So it doesn't go for a second review. And again, this is one approach, one philosophy. It doesn't mean it's the right way necessarily, and it may not fit for everyone, but early on, we've got a lot of buy-in from our nurse managers, our nursing leadership to have that approach, and it's worked well for us. And so, with that being said, I am not a part of the fact-finding meeting with the employee, and we can get into that, Terri, if you want, but want to share my thoughts on that first and allow perhaps Mary or you to ask follow-up questions from that.
Yeah, we'll definitely get into that because I think that's, it's interesting, and it gives us all something different to think about too. And you bring up a good point. This is the way we do it. It doesn't mean it's the best. There's more than one right answer, I think. I don't think there's a single right answer out there. And within a given circumstance, there could be a different answer, right? Maybe this is the way we normally do it, but we need to be ready to kind of pivot and switch if we think it will work better. A different way will work better in a situation. And being a consultant, I don't represent a specific entity, but I can tell you that experiences from the past with a system that has a more developed program, it's a lot like what the two of you have in terms of how you go about things, and a group kind of determining whether it's going to go, or speaking first to a manager and see if there's another explanation, something that they don't know, getting those, like you said, Mary, what else is happening? And I'll be interested to hear if we have time. I think a lot of times the first question of, are you noticing anything? The answer is no. And then when you start to probe and you ask a little bit more specific questions, then you're like, that's kind of important, you know, and they don't recognize it as being important in terms of behavioral or performance issues. But then that collaboration and deciding whether to go, go forward and have that interview, it sounds like it's very similar in many institutions. I have worked with smaller places that don't have a developed program, and it really comes down to, well, one place that I did work at where I was in staffing before becoming a consultant, it was kind of my decision, which I didn't like that. It was all up to me, which, you know, that's a lot of responsibility. And then sometimes when I felt very strongly, you know, I had to then be the one to totally escalate up because, you know, I can't let this one go. This one is really, really important. But in general, I think we all have about the same process. And yeah, Adam, as you alluded to, you're not in the, you call it a fact finding, it sounds like, instead of an interview, which is a different terminology. But you had also mentioned in passing, which caught my attention, that you do not feel that the person conducting the audit, performing the audit, should be involved in the interview, which is different than the way I felt, and I know many others, and we were all pushing like, you got to have the diversion specialist in the room. They know the story. So talk to us about that. Why?
Sure.
What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so, you know, again, this is one philosophy. It doesn't mean it's right. Diversion is so nebulous that there could be 1,000 different solutions and everyone come to the same, you know, conclusion, right? So this is what works best for us. And you know, the reason that I feel strongly about not being a part of those conversations is because we're doing the investigation. My role within that investigation is to collect the data and be really objective with what I'm seeing and sharing that information for the nurse manager and nursing director or whomever it might be from a supervisor position to then determine, okay, something serious is going on here, right? And so we help collect the information, we help tell the story for them, but the data is only part of the story. And so I don't know that individual, I don't know their background, I don't know their personal life. There's so much more context within that individual that I'm not aware of. On the day-to-day, as I'm reviewing this individual, you know, in my role, I want to catch diversion, right? I want to prevent it from occurring in the future. And so unconsciously, I think we all develop sort of a bias to say, yes, that person's diverting, right? And we can come up with all these different data points to prove that. But at the end of the day, you know, are they diverting? I don't know. And so that's why I think it's important to have someone else in that room having that conversation with that person, because I feel like I am predetermined to what I want the outcome to be. And that's not fair to that individual. Now, you could say, and the other side of this argument is, well, perhaps their supervisor is biased in the opposite direction where they don't want to believe that person's diverting, which can be true. And I've seen that happen time and time again. But I think that's where it's really important that it's the right person in the room, whether it's the diversion specialist or whether it's the nurse manager or the nurse director or pharmacy director, whomever it is. One, they don't have any skin in the game, they're unbiased, and two, they're experienced in those conversations. They know the right questions to ask, they know how to frame questions, they're not afraid of those difficult conversations, which, you know, those can be really hard conversations to have. And so, again, I steer away from being a part of those conversations to remove any bias on my end. But I also think it's important that the individuals in the room, that person knows the employee on some level, and then there's some witness there to also help guide the conversation, because, you know, the last thing we want is that that employee to say, oh, well, that person has it out for me and they're lying about what I said in that room, et cetera, et cetera. Well, that other person in the room is there to corroborate the story, help guide the conversation, keep them on track. And, I could go into many more details why I think it's important to have those individuals in the room. But I think lastly, we want to make sure that employee feels comfortable in that position. And if I'm the drug diversion guy in the room, their perception of what's going on is going to shift pretty drastically, right? And so I really want the employee to feel comfortable in that situation to either confess if they are diverting, or say, hey, I have a problem, I need help. And I think that environment really allows them to do that more. And so again, there's several more reasons which I'd be happy to get into, but those are kind of the few that jump out to me.
Okay, that makes sense. Mary, what are your thoughts? Because I think you are involved in the interviews, right?
So yes, just to go back a little bit, if the concern is more of non-compliance, or we don't have those behavioral concerns to kind of build that puzzle or paint that picture of diversion, that's when I do kind of let the clinical director, the nursing director, take lead on that interview. What else is going on? Sometimes it becomes, something more recently I've been seeing is, oh, it's a new nurse. We've been seeing a lot of the new grad, less than a year, with some compliance issues or time management issues, right? Which again, those are things we don't know when we're looking at the data. So I think if it's more of a non-compliance concern, that's really when the clinical director leads that conversation, and then we go into a monitoring mode. So we would monitor from there. But if we have the diversion response team meeting, there is a high enough level of concern for diversion, that is when I will get involved and lead the interview. I think for several reasons, this is the path that Honor Health has taken. The data can sometimes be really hard to convey and to understand clearly. Like, we do this every single day. We get into the weeds. We're very tedious with this, sifting through all of this data. So we get it. We understand it. But you have a clinical director that has, 100 other competing priorities in any given day. For them to really sit down and understand that data is complex. It's difficult for them. So I think that, being able to have that information at the interview to really challenge the person that we're interviewing for really good answers, to have that rigorous interview. I feel like the person that is most intimate with that data should be at the table, maybe not leading it. Maybe that is a consideration, that the clinical director takes more over the lead of that, with the drug diversion specialist having the data and the knowledge of that. So there are a lot of different ways to approach it. I do think so.
Yeah.
I agree with that, definitely.
Yeah. Go ahead, Adam.
I was just going to say, you mentioned the word fact finding, and I think it's really important here to call that out, because in my opinion, the interview or fact finding is an opportunity for the employee to state their claim of what went down, right? And so there might be a reason as to why the data is presenting itself a particular way. I think COVID has taught us that workflows change, very fast because of certain circumstances, right? And so the data can be misleading and not tell the right story. And so, the reason we call it a fact finding is because really we want that person to be able to speak to the activity they're doing for us to then make a determination how we want to go forward. And so through that conversation, and I'm sure Mary has the same approach here, we try to stick to the facts and not, accuse that individual of diverting or doing something nefarious. We really are trying to understand the situation, right? Help me understand why you're doing it this way. And so from that, you can learn a lot. And then, you can parse out, is this diversion? Is this, a practice concern in this area? Are they a new employee, et cetera, et cetera? But I think we, it wouldn't be fair if we did not give that employee an opportunity to speak to our findings. And so that's why we approach it that way.
Right. Okay. I've got a couple of questions. I do want to go backwards just a little bit. I think it is important, especially for those that are kind of new in this space. I think when we've been at it for a while, we have seen more, obviously, and we start to, we look at the data and we're like, meh, I think we got a live one here. But for those of us that have been in it for a while, I think we also have learned our lesson, where we've maybe thought that in the past, and then we have discovered some other bit of information. So I don't know about the two of you, but I have gotten to the point where, yeah, I think we have a live one, but I'm always open to hearing something else, because I have been there, done that, and I have gotten other information in the past that I never would have anticipated. And it's like, okay, I think this is a practice issue, workflow issue, what have you. So I want to point that out. And what you say, Adam, about being biased in the opposite direction, again, I think with experience, we get to the point where we can be less bias. Even if we think there is something, we hold the door open for another explanation because we've learned. But we do need to be careful when it comes to interpreting the data. And because you're right, with most data, you can take it to mean what you want it to mean, right? And so I am familiar with some of the software products too. And depending on how I use that, if I don't take work days into consideration, or number of patients for an anesthesiologist, let's say, compared to peers, or even different cases, the very basic of what you're comparing. There's a lot of different things. And if you don't have the experience and know how to take all of that into consideration, or you just want to jump to your conclusion, then it can paint an extremely different picture, which means something very, very different. So that, I forgot what I was going to say. What I wanted to, I want to go back. Oh, I think I wanted to ask, so Adam, in your interview, your fact finding, we're all on the same page with that. That's where we all start. Do you then, once you go through the beginning of that and you can't find another explanation, does it then progress to a different kind of tone in terms of like letting them know, something's not adding up here? Or how does that work?
Sure. So, typically before any fact finding happens, now, let me back up. There are certain situations where it's all hands on deck. We need to, talk to this person ASAP, right? Those are a different situation. We could get into that later, maybe a different conversation. But those folks aside, typically I have time to at least speak with the supervisor and the person who's going to do the fact finding. I really want to share with them what I'm seeing in the data, and explain to them why these particular things are not part of our normal practice and why they're concerning. So giving them the backbone to stand on and helping them frame the questions to ask the individual through that. Our particular software solution that we use for drug diversion allows us to print out a case report of all the information, which we find incredibly helpful during our fact-finding meetings, because all the information is there in front of the supervisor. It can be shared with the employee to help explain, hey, what happened here on this date? Why is it showing like this, right? And so to answer your question, I know I'm getting long-winded here, but all of that's really important on the front end to make sure that people in the room feel comfortable having the conversation and feel like they have all the tools they need in that conversation. And from there, they're really guiding where it needs to go. I would say most of the time, if not all the time, we end up doing that urine drug screen in administrative leave, because it then gives us that time to get back together as a team, determine what next steps are. Whether it is just poor practice, great. Now we can develop, a plan for that individual going forward. How do we want to monitor him? What else do we need to be looking at? What are we missing in our diversion reviews? What workflow changes do we need to consider because of this situation? So there's a lot within that we can focus on while that person's out. Again, if it's not diversion, that person might be out a day or two, maybe 3-4 days max, right? But if it is diversion, then we're removing them from the situation and eliminating future patient harm from occurring. So I don't think there's anything wrong with to escalate to that point. And we've almost gotten to a place where it's kind of just the common next step of the process. Now, obviously, there's the exception there that you pointed out. If the individual, has reasonable explanations for everything that's going on, we'll also talk through those scenarios beforehand to say, okay, if Jane Doe comes in here and she has reasonable explanations for X, Y, and Z, her story adds up, maybe we do just send her home for the day and then talk as a team and determine next steps from there, right? So there's a lot of different ways we can approach it, but typically it is putting that person on admin leave in the urine drug screen to allow us that opportunity to dig deeper. And again, it's going to change person to person, depending on the person's response, the employee's response, how they react. Are they emotional about the situation? Are they crying for help because they have, substance abuse disorder? So many things can happen within that room, and that's where I also feel like maybe I'm not the best to address those issues that person might have, and whereas the nurse manager or the supervisor can address those needs almost immediately, right? And so a lot goes on within the conversation, and I wish I could tell you, if this happens, steer left. If this happens, steer right. It's just never going to be that way, right? You just never know how a person's going to react. And so it's really hard to answer the question, but you kind of just have to have that emotional intelligence to understand and predict what the outcomes could be and how that person's going to respond, and kind of just adjust from there.
Right. Yeah. No, that makes sense. Mary, you had mentioned about being the most familiar with the data, and I am totally with you on that. Adam says that they can do the printout, and I know that I've, prepared the full audit, and all the information is on there. But when you're digging deep and you're actually looking, there's some stuff that you're not necessarily putting on paper, but it's in the back of your mind, and it kind of all ties together. So I understand what you're saying in terms of the auditor is the most familiar, and it's hard to bring everybody up to speed. I don't know if you have any more comments on that or anything else that Adam has discussed.
Yeah, maybe just a couple of other things that I think are important for us to think about when we're looking at investigations. One of them is, looking at the full picture. So including any of those actions with non-controlled substances that are going on. Mm-hmm. So that just adds, what does that add in, like 75% more data if we're looking at all the non-controlled dispenses, right? But sometimes it's important, we all know those diphenhydramine, promethazine, if you still have that in your Pyxis on your formulary, other things that you'll see and be able to parse out. So, I think that's important.
It's not only the drugs, those drugs, but it's also like if you're seeing delayed administrations or back charting, or are you seeing it with the non-controls as well? Is that their practice? Mm-hmm. Or do they do everything the way they're supposed to and follow policy with those, but they don't with the controls? So there's that piece too.
Right. Exactly. Like they don't document controlled substance in the MAR, but then all of their non-controls are documented perfectly. Well, wow. Right. Even maybe something that was dispensed at the same time. So yeah, that really requires that level of review. The other thing I like to do is review security camera footage if you have it over your Pyxis machines, because it's just interesting to me to see what someone's behavior is like. Are they relaxed in the med room? Are they, pulling out their vial of morphine and setting it on top of the Pyxis? You'll see people do that. They do their count and they just set it right here, almost like you're, looking at a blackjack table in Vegas or something. Their hands are open. They have everything on display that they're doing. There's no secrets. They're not looking over their shoulder. Just their general behavior really gives you some information about investigation. Look at, a normal appearing waste process. It wasn't a late waste. It wasn't a batch waste. It wasn't any of those things that we pick out as a pattern. But we can look at that, just a normal everyday waste, and see, what does the other person do? Is it what we would anticipate being a compliant waste process with, visualization, dispensing, disposing of the medication into the appropriate waste bin at the time that it's documented? Those kind of things, again, will just give you more information, to fuel that investigation, I think. So just a couple of tips there that I think, are important in that investigation part.
Yeah, that's all good. And I think one of the conclusions that we came to when we had this conversation previously, and we've said it, there's not necessarily one right way, but I think what we all agreed on, and I think what everybody would agree with, is that whoever is conducting the interview and leading the interview needs to be familiar with the case, and needs to have some interview training and some sort of skill set, right? If you take any of those elements out, you're going to miss tremendous opportunity, either because you don't know what the right answer should be and what it looks like from a clinical perspective. I know I've been, at places where HR conducts the interview, and while they may have experience conducting interviews, they don't have the clinical knowledge unless they've maybe been there a while and have picked up, what is appropriate and what isn't. But so many times I would have HR come back to me and then ask me a question. They said this, does that make sense? It's like, nope, doesn't make any sense at all. But we've now lost our window of opportunity to redirect because the interview is over, right? And you're in that, okay, we'll get back to you phase. So there's that. Or if somebody is the diversion specialist and they have all of the information, but they don't know how to conduct an interview. Because I was just talking to somebody today that was saying, I don't know if I'm comfortable with this. He's a director of pharmacy, and that's not our natural skill set. And so, yeah, I get it. I can see how you wouldn't be comfortable with that. So it's asking those hard questions and really knowing how to listen. So I think a lot of it is, that's what it comes down to. And if you have found a way to make it work in your institution that takes all of those things into consideration, and you're doing what would be considered thorough fact-finding or interviews, and your process is with the right people in the room for your organization, then I think that's what's going to give you the best chance of success, really.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think you said this, interviewing is a skill, and skills take time and practice, right? And so it's really important that the person going in there, one, has a game plan for the interview, but two, that you practice these scenarios, anticipate what the person's going to say on the other side of the table, and then, go through simulations and then do it again with a different outcome, or a different scenario, and continue to do that and get comfortable with asking those tough questions. I think with anything, it really depends on the right person. Sure, I could conduct the interviews. I feel comfortable in those situations, and for me, it's not a matter of conducting it, but other people don't feel that way, right? And pharmacists in general, especially if we're in this world and looking at data all the time, maybe we're more comfortable looking at our computer screens than talking to someone and having a difficult conversation, right? And so that's okay, but making sure that whoever is doing the interview is prepped for the interview, has practiced, can anticipate what's going to happen, and stay unbiased throughout that process. I think that's your best chance for success.
Yep. Anticipate, but be able to pivot.
Exactly.
You get thrown a loop. Yeah, all of that makes sense. Mary, anything else? Any final thoughts that you have or want to share?
I think in a final thought would just be something that we are beginning to work at in my organization is our response to drug diversion and those with substance use disorder. I think if you have a system that has a compassionate response and it's not immediate termination, and your staff knows this, then your interview is going to go down whichever path you've already chosen. I think that if it's immediate termination, staff is going to deny because it's of self-preservation. If they know that if they admit it, they're going to lose their job, lose their insurance, they know if they don't admit it, that they have the potential to stay in the job, or we might not report to the board. However, we normally do report to the board even in denials. You've kind of chosen your own path by what the policy is of the organization. So I think it's important that organizations, look at those policies and consider just culture when you're looking at response to drug diversion.
That's true. Yeah, because if I know that the outcome is going to be really bad if I confess, I might as well hold on and keep seeing if I can convince you otherwise and then quit on my own time, right? Make my own decision. So you have a good point. This is off topic, but before we go, I do want to ask, since I have you both here, you both do urine drug screens. Do you have a feel for how often it comes back negative when you kind of thought you had something going on? And so does that negative result then mess up anything, or does it prevent you from term, or what do you do with it when you're, thinking you should have gotten a positive?
Adam, do you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to answer. Like anything, just like data, just like the conversation with the individual, with the employee, it's one piece of information. And so you have to understand that a urine drug screen, depending on when you're taking it, depending on what that person's diverting, depending on what home medications they have, it may show as negative. They could be selling it, or they could be distributing it to family members. There's a lot of reasons to divert medications. Now, the most obvious one is for, substance use disorders, but that's not always the case. And, I'd be happy to share examples offline of when that was not the case. But, just understanding that's one piece of the puzzle. And there's a lot of explanations why that could be negative. Case in point, you can have a prescription for a medication. That person could also be diverting that same medication within the health system. And so understanding that, and I think expressing that with the hiring manager, the director, HR, and everyone, making sure everyone understands that, hey, drug screen is not end all be all. If it comes back positive, I think then that information is helpful in circumstances to then dig a little deeper, because maybe it tests positive for a drug that you weren't concerned about it initially, right? And now all of a sudden it's positive for a metabolite of fentanyl, and now you're scrambling to say, oh, wow, I need to really look into fentanyl now, because that was not on my radar initially, but now it should be. So, I think understanding that and putting it into context, it's just not the end all be all. You're not going to solve every case with a urine drug screen, but it allows you that extra time to then investigate further and come to a conclusion.
Right. Yeah. Mary?
So I totally agree with what Adam said. But sometimes it is very difficult for others involved to not let the urine drug screen be the end all. Oh, it's negative, they're not diverting. So the conversation always has to be had. Like, we need to consider, what will our response be if the urine drug screen is negative? I have some examples. I've had 2 confessions where nurses said, yes, I was diverting, and both of them had a negative urine drug screen. So, it does happen.
Were they diverting for self-use? So it should have, you would have expected a positive.
Yes.
Could the negative have been because they had prescriptions for?
Not to my knowledge, no.
Okay.
Not to my knowledge in either case that they had prescriptions.
Okay.
So,
and just to clarify for people that maybe aren't as aware, because I know I wasn't for quite some time, many facilities will deem it a negative test if the employee tests positive for something they have a prescription for. And so all we will know is that it was negative when indeed there was something in the urine.
Correct.
Okay, sorry, Mary, to interrupt you. Carry on.
Yep. So yes, in neither of the cases
Interesting.
did the nurse say that they had a prescription. So,
Interesting.
and then we did have a case, again, similar to what Adam mentioned, where I was looking specifically at OxyIR is the drug of choice. Very high utilization rate of OxyIR with this nurse. And that was really what I had pegged as the drug of choice. The urine drug screen came back positive for fentanyl. So we did just that. We go back, I look at every single fentanyl dispense because there were very few in this area. So I didn't have a lot of data to look at. So I looked at every single one of them and did not see a problem with any of them. I think it's something that we need to consider in drug diversion is looking at the availability of illicit fentanyl specifically. And I don't have confirmation that that was the case here, but it certainly was the first thing that popped into my mind. Illicit fentanyl is cheap. It's not expensive at all. It's readily available, especially here in Arizona. So I think it's something that we need to consider. And again, that's a really important reason to do a urine drug screen is to pick those things up.
Yeah, interesting. So later, I'd like to hear more about, was she diverting oxy or was she not? And she had another problem, because that's interesting. Yeah, the twists and turns that things take, right?
Every case.
All right. Yeah. Okay. I want to thank you both. I'm sure we could keep going. We've already gone much longer than I usually like to go, but I'm sure we could go for another couple of hours at least with this conversation. So I thank you both for your time. I know you're really busy, but hopefully this was eye-opening and meaningful for those listening. And they can just see that we don't all do it the same way. We usually have a good reason for doing it a different way. And it makes you think when you start having the conversations that maybe there is a different way that also works, right? There's many ways to do it.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Thank you,
All
Terri.
right. Thank you, guys.
Thanks.